I still remember the sound before I remember the fence, not the clanging of steel posts or the rumble of heavy equipment, but the sound of one of my old cows bawling from the far pasture like something didn't feel right. And after living on the same ranch your whole life, you learn to trust little things like that because animals notice trouble before people ever do. My family has worked this land since 1952, long before anyone thought it was a good idea to carve luxury neighborhoods into the Texas hills. And every fence line, every oak tree, every dry creek bed has a story tied to somebody in my family. My grandfather used to tell me that land doesn't belong to us. We just borrow it from the next generation. So you protect it while you're here. That's exactly why what happened that Monday morning felt less like someone stealing dirt and more like someone walking into my grandfather's living room and putting their boots on his coffee table. I climbed into my old diesel pickup just after sunrise because one of the ranch hands called saying he'd spotted construction crews near the eastern pasture. At first I figured somebody had gotten lost. Happens all the time. Folks from fancy neighborhoods think every dirt road is public until they realize their GPS doesn't know the difference between private ranch land and county property. But as I crested the hill, my stomach dropped. Fresh chain-link fencing stretched across the pasture as far as I could see. Shiny galvanized steel reflecting the morning light like it had been there for years, even though I knew every inch of that field had been open the night before. Concrete around the fence posts was still wet. Orange survey flags danced in the breeze. Bulldozers sat parked in a neat row waiting for the workday to begin, and every 10 feet there was another sign that read Future Riding Academy Expansion. I shut the truck off and just sat there for a second, staring. 8 acres. 8 acres of my land had been fenced off overnight like somebody thought if they built fast enough I'd simply accept it. One of the foremen walked over carrying a clipboard like he actually expected me to apologize for interrupting their morning. He smiled and said, "Sir, you'll need to stay outside the construction zone." I actually laughed because I thought he was joking. "Construction zone?" I asked. "Buddy, one. You're standing in my pasture." His smile disappeared. He looked back at his papers, then at me, then back at the fence. "We've got permits," he said carefully. "Then I suggest you frame them," I replied. "Because they don't change where my property line is." He didn't argue after that. Instead, he pulled out his phone and stepped away, probably calling whoever had convinced him this was a good idea. While he did that, I walked the fence line myself, counting posts, checking landmarks, measuring against old cedar markers my father had shown me when I was 12 years old. There wasn't any doubt. Not 1 inch. The entire project sat squarely inside my property. On the drive back to the house, I remembered a letter I tossed into a kitchen drawer about 2 months earlier. Cedar Ridge Estates. That was the neighborhood across my eastern fence line. Their homeowners association had mailed an offer asking if I'd sell a small portion of pasture for what they called a future community enhancement project. They offered $50,000 like they were doing me a favor. I never answered because the land wasn't for sale. Some things don't have a price. Apparently silence wasn't the answer they wanted, so somebody decided to skip the negotiation altogether. That afternoon I called my surveyor, Ethan Mercer, a man I'd known for 20 years. He met me before sunset carrying maps older than some of the people living in Cedar Ridge. We walked the entire boundary together, checked every monument, every legal description, every county record. When he finally folded the maps back into the tube, he looked at me and said, "Luke, they're not close. They're 8 acres onto your property." Hearing somebody else say it somehow made me even calmer. Anger is loud at first, but real determination gets quiet. That's when I started thinking instead of reacting. I wasn't interested in screaming at board members or posting online or giving interviews. I wanted to understand how people wealthy enough to build a multi-million-dollar equestrian center could be careless enough to build it on land they didn't own. So I spent the rest of the evening digging through old property records, yellowed easement documents, county maps, and handwritten notes my grandfather kept in metal filing cabinets. Around midnight, I found something that made me lean back in my chair and smile for the first time all day. The only paved road leading into Cedar Ridge Estates. Every delivery truck, every contractor, every school bus, every emergency vehicle crossed a quarter-mile of my family's property. My grandfather had allowed the developer to use it decades ago with nothing more than a handshake because back then neighbors still trusted each other. There was no recorded easement, no permanent agreement, no payment. Just courtesy that had quietly lasted for years until someone forgot the difference between generosity and entitlement. I closed the file cabinet, looked out the kitchen window toward the dark pasture, and realized the people across that fence believed they had all the leverage. They had no idea they were about to discover who actually owned the only road home. Tuesday morning started before sunrise because I already knew exactly what I was going to do. And the funny thing about having a clear plan is how peaceful everything suddenly feels. I poured myself a cup of coffee, watched the steam drift across the porch, and listened to coyotes finishing whatever business coyotes have before daylight. My ranch foreman, Miguel, pulled into the driveway just after 6, took one look at my face, and asked, "We're not calling lawyers first?" I shook my head. "Lawyers will have their turn. Right now I'm teaching a lesson they'll never forget." He smiled because he'd worked beside my father before me, and he knew our family had always believed actions carried more weight than speeches. We drove out to the northern pasture where 50 black Angus bulls stood waiting near the loading pens. Massive animals that looked intimidating even when they were standing perfectly still. Miguel raised an eyebrow. "You're really doing this?" "They built a fence," I said. "Seems rude to let it go unused." 20 minutes later, trailer after trailer rolled toward the freshly fenced construction site. The crews had just begun unloading equipment when the first gate swung open and 1,500 pounds of pure muscle stepped into what was supposed to become Cedar Ridge's luxury riding academy. One bull wandered over to a stack of lumber and started scratching his neck against it. Another found fresh sod irresistible. Within minutes, the carefully planned construction zone looked more like an active cattle pasture, which, of course, it actually was. The foreman from the day before came running toward me waving both arms. "You can't do this," he yelled. I looked around with exaggerated confusion. "Can't do what?" "You're releasing livestock into a construction site." "No," I corrected him calmly. "I'm releasing livestock onto my ranch. The fact that somebody illegally built a construction site around them isn't really my problem." He opened his mouth, closed it again, then reached for his phone. I figured that would happen. While he was making another frantic call, Miguel and I drove over to the old iron gate where the paved access road crossed my property. It was a gate my grandfather had installed decades earlier, mostly to keep wandering cattle from drifting onto the road. We swung it shut, wrapped a heavy chain through the bars, snapped a commercial-grade padlock into place, and mounted a freshly painted sign that read "Private Property, Temporary Access, Suspended Pending Easement Negotiations." We climbed back into the truck just as the morning traffic began. The first landscaping crew stopped, then a plumbing contractor, then 3 concrete trucks. Within half an hour, there was a line of vehicles stretching farther than I could see in the mirror. Some drivers climbed out to ask what happened. Others immediately started calling dispatch. A few homeowners leaned out their SUV windows looking completely bewildered. One woman in expensive workout clothes actually demanded I move the gate because she had a Pilates class in 40 minutes. I politely suggested she might enjoy the extra exercise from taking the alternate route. She didn't appreciate my sense of humor nearly as much as Miguel did. The alternate route added almost 9 miles and forced everyone through county traffic instead of the private entrance they treated like their own driveway for years. Around lunchtime, my phone rang. The caller ID simply read, "Brad Collins, president of Cedar Ridge Estates." We had never spoken before. "Mr. Dawson," he began, trying very hard to sound professional. "I think there's been some misunderstanding." "I don't think so," I replied. "Your misunderstanding started when you fenced my pasture." His voice hardened immediately. "You cannot legally block the primary access road for 250 families." I leaned against my truck and looked at the locked gate. "Interesting choice of words," I said. "Primary access road. My records say private ranch road." There was silence for several seconds before he answered. "We've been using that road for years." "Yes," I said. "You have. Free of charge." "That's called an easement." "Actually," I interrupted, "it's called my grandfather being kinder than you deserved. He didn't like that. If you don't reopen that gate within the hour, we'll seek an emergency injunction." "Please do," I answered. "While you're at the courthouse, ask your attorney why your equestrian center is sitting 8 acres inside my property line." He hung up without another word. By Wednesday morning, the entire county seemed to know what was happening. Neighbors I'd never met slowed down just to wave. Ranchers from 20 miles away called offering everything from legal advice to barbecue. One old-timer laughed so hard over the phone he had to stop twice to catch his breath before saying, "Son, your granddad would have loved this." Around noon, a silver Mercedes rolled through the shoulder of the road until it reached the locked gate. A tall man in a charcoal suit stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Richard Fallon, legal counsel for Cedar Ridge Estates. Everything about him screamed expensive confidence. He didn't waste time with small talk. "Mr. Dawson," he said, "my clients believe your actions constitute unlawful interference with established access." "That's a fancy sentence," I replied. "Would you like to see another one?" I handed him a thick envelope. Inside were certified surveys, aerial photographs, county parcel maps, drone images from the previous morning, time-stamped videos of construction equipment crossing onto my land, and dozens of photographs documenting every stage of the unauthorized fencing. Ethan had prepared everything overnight, and it looked beautiful. Richard flipped through the documents, his expression changing a little more with every page. "These surveys," he muttered. "Registered yesterday morning," I answered. "The drone footage, time-stamped. Construction permits? Valid," I said. "Just not on my property." He looked toward the pasture, where several of the bulls were peacefully grazing beside stacks of unused fencing material. "Your livestock are causing significant project delays." "No," I corrected him. "Your trespassing project is inconveniencing my livestock." Miguel had to turn away because he was trying not to laugh. Richard closed the folder and took a slower breath. "What exactly do you want?" There it was, the first honest question anyone from Cedar Ridge had asked since this whole mess started. I reached into my truck and handed him another envelope. This one contained a proposed easement agreement, 20 years, $8,000 a month, $200,000 due upon signing, annual maintenance of the roadway at their expense, quarterly inspections under my approval, immediate restoration of every square foot of damaged pasture using native grasses selected by my ranch manager, complete removal of all unauthorized fencing, compensation for soil disturbance, insurance coverage protecting my family from future liability, a formal acknowledgement that all previous access had been granted solely as a revocable courtesy. Richard scanned the first page, then looked up. "Mr. Dawson, this is outrageous." I smiled politely. "Compared to building a $2 million equestrian center on somebody else's ranch?" He didn't answer. "You'll never convince a judge to approve these terms," he finally said. "Maybe not," I admitted. "But I don't have to convince the judge today. I only have to keep that gate locked while the hearings work their way through court." His eyes drifted toward the traffic still crawling along the distant highway detour. Every hour construction sat idle was costing somebody money. Every landscaping contract delayed triggered penalties. Every homeowner complaining increased pressure on the HOA board. The leverage wasn't emotional anymore. It had become mathematical. Before Richard left, I offered him a bottle of cold water. He accepted it with a tired smile. "Can I give you one piece of advice?" he asked. "Sure." "Don't underestimate how stubborn HOA boards can be." I laughed quietly. "Counselor, neither should you underestimate a ranch family that's been protecting the same land for 70 years. He drove away looking far less confident than when he'd arrived. That evening, my daughter Emma sat beside me on the porch, watching the sunset paint a pasture gold. She was home from college for the summer and had followed every update through our family group chat before deciding to drive out and see the circus herself. "Dad," she asked softly, "are you doing this because of the money?" I stared toward the locked gate for a long moment before answering. "No, sweetheart. If this were about money, I would have taken the $50,000 months ago." "Then why?" I smiled without taking my eyes off the horizon. "Because once people discover they can take a piece of your land without consequences, they stop seeing boundaries altogether." Emma nodded slowly. "Grandpa would have said the same thing." "Yeah," I whispered. "He probably would have said it louder." Early Friday morning, my phone buzzed again. This time, Brad Collins didn't sound angry. He sounded exhausted. He asked one simple question. "Can we meet without the lawyers?" I looked out across the pasture where 50 bulls were still calmly grazing inside the world's most expensive accidental cattle pen, and I had a feeling a real negotiation was finally about to begin. Friday afternoon. Brad Collins pulled into my driveway alone in a plain pickup instead of the luxury SUV I'd seen parked outside HOA meetings. And somehow that told me more than anything he could have said. He climbed out carrying no briefcase, no entourage, no lawyer, just a worn leather folder tucked under one arm. "Mind if we talk?" he asked. I pointed toward the porch. "Coffee's fresh." We sat there for almost a minute without speaking, watching the breeze move across the pasture where those 50 bulls were still grazing, like they hadn't accidentally become the most effective negotiating team in Texas. Finally, Brad let out a long breath. "I owe you an apology." I didn't answer right away because I wanted to hear the rest. "When the board approved the equestrian project," he continued, Our engineering consultant assured us the survey matched county records. Then, someone remembered your old purchase offer and convinced the board you weren't interested in that section anymore. By the time questions started coming up, we'd already spent hundreds of thousands preparing the site. Nobody wanted to admit we'd made a mistake. I looked over at him. So instead, you doubled down. He nodded without trying to defend himself. I've spent 30 years in corporate management, he admitted. Sometimes people become more afraid of looking wrong than actually doing the right thing. That was probably the most honest sentence I'd heard from anyone connected to Cedarbrook Preserve since this whole mess began. I slid the easement agreement across the table again. Nothing in here is personal, I said. I'm not trying to bankrupt your neighborhood. I'm making sure what my grandfather gave away with a handshake is finally protected with ink. Brad read every page carefully this time instead of skimming through it. When he reached the signature line, he uncapped his pen, paused for just a second, then signed his name. The board already voted this morning, he said quietly. Unanimous. Before sunset, the wire transfer confirmation for $200,000 hit my account. The monthly easement payments were scheduled to begin the following month. Cedarbrook agreed to rebuild every inch of damaged pasture under EFIN supervision, reseed it with native grasses instead of decorative landscaping, maintain the access road at their expense, carry full liability insurance, and acknowledge in county records that access across my property existed only because of a negotiated legal agreement, not because anyone had somehow earned the right to it through habit. Monday morning was almost surreal. The same bulldozers that had rolled onto my ranch with confidence backed away one by one. Construction crews dismantled every section of chain-link fence they'd installed. Fresh topsoil replaced compacted ground. Seed trucks followed behind. By Tuesday afternoon, the pasture looked closer to normal than I ever expected, and Miguel leaned against the fence beside me, grinning as another crew carefully repaired a damaged cattle guard. Think they'll remember this? He asked. I chuckled. Their accountants definitely will. We opened the gate later that afternoon. Traffic flowed normally again. Except now every truck, every delivery van, every moving company, and every resident crossed that quarter mile knowing it wasn't simply a road anymore. It was a legal privilege that carried responsibilities. And strangely enough, people started treating it with respect. Drivers slowed down around livestock. Maintenance crews called before performing work near the property line. Even the HOA landscaping committees sent written notices before trimming vegetation close to the easement. Respect arrived the moment entitlement left. A few weeks later, I ran into Brad at the county fair. Neither of us mentioned lawsuits or fences. Instead, he asked how the pasture was recovering, and I asked how the neighborhood meeting had gone. He laughed and admitted he'd probably be remembered as the president who spent $200,000 fixing a mistake that should never have happened. Maybe, I said. Or maybe you'll be remembered as the guy who finally stopped pretending your community could solve every problem by throwing lawyers at it. He smiled, shook my hand, and for the first time, we actually felt like neighbors instead of opponents. Every now and then, someone asks whether I regret locking that gate or releasing those bulls into the fenced pasture. The truth is, I don't enjoy conflict. I'd rather spend my mornings fixing fences that belong on my land, checking water troughs, and listening to the wind move through the mesquite trees than arguing with anyone. But there comes a point when protecting peace requires standing your ground. My grandfather's generation understood that kindness without boundaries eventually becomes permission, and permission has a strange way of turning into expectation. That ranch survived droughts, floods, cattle markets crashing, and more than one hard season because the people before me refused to give away what couldn't be replaced. I simply followed the example they left behind. So now I'm curious what you think. If your neighbor built a multi-million-dollar project on your property, would you have gone straight to court? Or would you have found another way to make them understand exactly where the property line really was? Let me know down in the comments, because I've seen people argue both sides of the story. And honestly, I can understand why. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's ever had a nightmare neighbor or an HOA that forgot where its authority ends. Trust me, this wasn't even the strangest property dispute I've ever lived through.